Hi guys, this is Lauren from Lauren Watkins Art, and today we are going to be doing a review and a speed painting. I will be reviewing Dr. PH Martins Hydrus Watercolors, as you can see in front of us, and I will be doing a speed painting of a grizzly bear, and it's going to be painted in a full rainbow, very vibrant colors, and so I'm using a lot of different colors of paint, more than I typically use in more of a traditional colored painting. I'm also giving you a view of some of the other materials I'll be using: masking fluid, a heat tool, a spray bottle, paintbrushes, and a palette, and some water. Now, Hydrus watercolors are a liquid watercolor. Instead of coming in a pan or a tube, they come in drop bottles and you just drip it out fresh when you need it. And I like to use a palette that has higher walls on it so the paint doesn't drip all over. Now, before I started painting, I drew out my picture and then I blocked off or masked off areas I wanted to preserve the highlights in, and so I took my masking fluid and I drew hair-like lines wherever I wanted to preserve the highlights and let that dry, and then I started adding in my color. I'm doing wet into wet washes right here, and as you can see, the Hydrus watercolors flow really nicely. They flow even better when you don't have a ton of masking fluid lines all over the place, because those can kind of act as like barriers or little dams that prevent it from flowing fully. That's part of the reason why I like using the spray bottle, and it creates nice effects when I'm trying to get a more organic flow type look. I used my heat tool to dry off the area before I added the next layer. I find that's really helpful, especially with these really wet into wet colorful paintings. Drying it off in between each layer is really important to keep the colors pure and vibrant. If I work in wet areas and then I add a random color to it, it's going to bleed into the color in areas that I don't want it to blend and bleed. So I dry it off in between each layer. I just don't show it because that would make this video incredibly long. Now I'm just right here adding in the base layers of the color, and then I will go in and add more detail. That's one of the things I love about Hydrus watercolor, is that I can layer and layer and layer, and I can do super wet washes over the top of previous layers, and I don't have to worry about it picking up those bottom layers too much. You can a little bit, but the colors are fairly staining, and so you don't get as much like intermixing of layers. So it keeps it very pure and vibrant if you want it to stay that way, or you can neutralize it. So as you see this picture progress, it's going to be very, very bright, and I'm going to have high chromatic color. And then towards the end of the picture, I'll start neutralizing and adding browns and grays where I want more shadow or where I don't want it to be too distracting. I'm just blocking in the nose now. Now I've been using Hydrus watercolors for about 2.5 years. They were my first professional grade watercolors that I bought. Before that, I had used, I guess I had Gonzai Tombi watercolors, and depending on who you talk to, those are professional grade or they're not. I didn't like them because I didn't like how little they flowed and bloomed out, but I also wasn't using them with great paper. Another paint that I used before I got my Dr. PH Martins, I've used Prang, I've used Crayola, lots of Crayola, and I also use Cotman watercolors. But this paint, when I got it, really opened my eyes to what watercolor could be. I had liked watercolor before, and that's why I was buying watercolors, but when I got these paints, it was amazing. I had got it, and I had also gotten Arches watercolor paper, and I did my first painting with those two things, and it just changed watercolor for me. And it's where I really not only liked watercolor, but I developed a really big passion for it and have spent a lot of time painting since then. I've done more traditional watercolor paintings with Hydrus watercolors in the past, and I really like it for that, but I kind of pick my paint depending on what I want the paint to do. If I want something more flowy and more vibrant, I tend to lean more towards my PH Martin paints. So this piece is perfect for it. If I'm doing a more traditional watercolor painting, I can do that pretty easily with my Hydrus watercolors, but lots of times I just grab a palette that's already set up and ready to go. And so it's personal choice and kind of what techniques I want to do and kind of how I want the paint to react. Now, Hydrus watercolors, pro or con depending on how you work, I find that they don't re-wet super great. Some colors, like the Viridian Green, doesn't really re-wet at all once it dries. So you're typically working with these paints fresh. When you can re-wet some of the colors, and I do that later in the picture, just using up some of the paint that was still on my palette on the second day. But when it dries, I find that it doesn't flow as well after, and it becomes more staining when you re-wet it. So it's just depending on what you need it for, but if you're a person that likes pans and you just like having it in a palette ready to go and you can just re-wet it at any time, I don't know if these are the best paints for you if you want to work like that with them. They really shine when you're working fresh. Now I'm starting to block in the colors of the ears. You can see it starting to bloom. I'm going to take my spray bottle and just kind of help it along the way. Now after I've sprayed it, you can see that I'm starting to kind of tip my board. Sorry, it looks a little weird on the camera, but I tend to tip my board a lot when I'm working with these paints in this style because I want a more organic, natural flow. I love seeing the lines as the color spreads, and so I tend to tip it and manipulate the board like that instead of always relying on a paintbrush. Now I'm just dropping in some more color and really letting those paints mix on the paper. I do a little bit of mixing on the palette, like I didn't have any green paint pulled out, and so I mixed the greens myself, or if I want a more neutralized color, I'll mix it, but lots of times I'll dilute the color down. I don't work with it full strength. I'll dilute it down with some water, but I mix it, I let the paints mix on the paper, particularly with this style where I want it to be more vibrant. Now, when I work with Hydrus watercolors, I'm actually typically using another paint with them. I work a lot with Brusho. It's a powdered watercolor. It's not light fast, but I will do it for the bottom layer because I can sprinkle it out and spray it, and I get even more of a look like what you see in the bear's ears. And so it creates a fun underpainting that I can kind of use as a guide of where I want the color to be without having tons of control on it. So I typically do those two paintings together, and then I'll do an overpainting with the Hydrus watercolors, which are light fast. I did not use the Brusho on this because I wanted this review to just focus on the Hydrus watercolors for you. Now I'm starting to glaze in more layers on the nose and adding more detail. Now I mentioned how I love how this paint is staining. I find it's particularly more staining on cotton papers like arches, which if you're switching from different types of paper, wood pulp paper, or even just different brands, the paper will work differently with your paints. And so just keep that in mind when you're working on different papers or you're using a new paper. You might want to do a practice one first just to see how your paints react, especially on something like this where you're so dependent on the paint to flow and to layer a specific way. Your paper can really influence that along with your paints. You also might be a person that doesn't like staining paints. You might want to blend it more smoothly, or you want to be able to scrub out your highlights. If you're a purist watercolorist, you don't typically go back over with any white paint or gouache or anything like that. You just preserve the highlights. Either with masking fluid. Some people don't even use masking fluid. It really depends on your style, but they depend on being able to scrub back any highlights that might have gotten highlighted areas that got colored with paint. So if you typically like to scrub back your highlights, this might not be the paint for you. Now we can see that I'm really starting to build up the shadows and layers on this painting. I like looking at my reference photo for a gauge of where the shadows fall, how the fur falls. Even if your painting isn't super realistic like this, it's really important to kind of have a reference so that or a really good understanding of how shadows and highlights fall, or with animals, how their fur lays as well, so that you can give the picture a more realistic, not realistic and it looks photorealistic, but a more natural look. It doesn't look flat, it has the shapes and values that you need. So I'm really starting to build that up. I'm also keeping in mind where the highlights on the fur fall. With grizzly bears, their fur tends to be lighter on the ends and darker towards the roots, and it kind of varies. That's why they're called grizzly bears. Their fur has a grizzled appearance. So I'm really playing that up in this painting. And so I'm really making sure I'm preserving the highlights. Even though I do have masking fluid down, you can't depend on your masking fluid being 100% perfect where you lay it, because you are laying it down before you even have any color. Now I'm starting to work on the detail around the eyes. Again, just looking at my reference photo, seeing the shape, where the shadows are on it. I find the eyes and like noses and those kinds of things are probably the more important aspect to drawing animals. If you can get those right, the rest can be pretty loose and not detailed, and people will still be able to know what kind of animal you're doing. So this is an area I take my time on, and just work slowly, and I'm just dripping in color and just gradually building this painting up layer by layer. I'll come back to these eyes probably 2 or 3 more times as I work to really get the details and the layer and the shadows that I want. Now when I'm all done doing the detail on this part, I dry my paper completely so that it's no longer cool to the touch, and then I take my pickup rubber eraser and start rubbing it over the paper. and start picking up the masking fluid. I really like using this rubber eraser because it doesn't smear any paint that might be sitting on top of the masking fluid. Now here you can see the masking fluid where it's been removed, and those bright highlights are what it preserved. And so it does a really nice job keeping those highlights super bright. Now I'll be going back in a little bit and toning down some of those highlights so that they aren't quite as vibrant, especially the ones in the shadow area. But I still use it in the shadow areas at the beginning because it will help add texture. Even though it's darker, it will add texture to the piece and still give that fur-like look. Now I'm refining the shapes of the eyes and the fur around it a little bit more here. And just taking my time and looking at the shapes and how the fur falls around the face. Typically with bears, especially around the eyes, it kind of goes over their brows and then flows around it, and it goes over their nose and then flows down from there. And so I'm making sure that my strokes are still following that, and it's really helping to refine the shape of the face and give it dimension. Now another thing to keep in mind with Hydrus watercolors is that they are very transparent paints. They are probably the most transparent watercolors I've used that aren't dye-based. Sometimes the dye-based ones will be more transparent, but they also aren't light fast. These use actual pigments in them, but they are ground so finely, and the way they are made they're super transparent, which I love because I love being able to glaze over an area of my painting like here and be able to still see the lines and the texture and the color that I put underneath it. But if you want something that's a little bit more opaque, as you like to work a little bit more thick or like to be able to block off all the pigment underneath it, these might not be the best paints for you. And that's also the pigments being so fine and so transparent is part of the reason why they are so staining. Typically the colors that aren't staining tend to be the ones that are a little bit more opaque. They have bigger pigment granules in them, and that makes it so they can be lifted back up. They don't sink down into the deepest parts of the paper. Now I've jumped ahead a little bit, and you can see I'm starting to add the final details on the nose and really starting to refine the details on the bear, pushing the values, the darks as dark as they need to be, and then I'll go back through in a little bit and add highlights to any areas that I didn't preserve the highlights enough using Dr. PH Martins Bombay ink. I really like that for layering, especially on this style where I still might do a wet wash over it. The ink is waterproof, and so it doesn't get picked up, unlike gouache where if you re-wet gouache it will blend and bleed. And so I just don't like using gouache with this style. Now I'm showing how I mix the paints, and I really like the Hydrus watercolors because they are really easy to mix a consistent wash. If you're trying to mix the same color, it's really easy to do because you already know how wet the paint is. It's why part of the reason why a lot of artists like to work with fresh watercolor, because they have the consistency of the paint has the same amount of water in it, versus from pans you might add a lot of water and it might be more diluted when you're trying to mix your color, and it can take a lot of work to pull it back out of the pans. I'm taking a dagger brush and starting to add some fine lines to show the hairs, more specific hairs and more detail. I really like this dagger brush because it can create really natural wiggly lines. So the dagger brush is super great for that. Now I'm going in with my a really small paintbrush and adding kind of the fine details using the ink I'm looking at my reference photo and seeing where the highlights are, kind of making and pulling those back. That way I can have more of a full range of value in my picture, so it has lots of dimension. Your value, as this picture demonstrates, is more important than the color. You can make anything any color you want it to be, and as long as your values and your shapes are correct, it will look like that. And now we are just on the final home stretch. I hope you enjoyed this painting as much as I did and found this review of the PH Martins Hydrus watercolors useful. If you have any questions, leave it in the comments below and I will do my best to respond to it and answer those questions for you. Also, more information about them is on my blog. Link is in the description below. If you want to hear more from me, please hit the subscribe button and the notification bell, and you will be notified when I post a new video. Thank you so much for watching. I really appreciate it. Bye.